So for everybody who's joined, as you can tell, we hope that this will be feel like an informal chat about a very important topic that has lots of very serious implications and notes, but we hope that this can be an informal chat where everyone feels free to participate. My name is Adam Gromis. I lead global sustainability policy at Uber. I have the great privilege of being the moderator of this very distinguished panel, which means I'm not listed on the SumC page, and that's the privilege of being the moderator. And I get the great privilege of sitting next to Shin-pei quite literally today, and Dan and Shelley and Giovanni. I'm so glad to be with all of our panelists today. What I'll do is introduce them as we get into our first question in a moment. Let me just set up this conversation very briefly with a few high-level thoughts. And what we'll do at the flow of it will be that Shin-pei and Shelley and Dan and Giovanni and I will have a bit of a chat. I have a few questions for them prepared, and we'll start putting the topics out on the table. Really more questions than answers, I imagine, in many cases. But we hope that that gives everybody a lot of topics to grab onto. If you have questions, thoughts, input, please insert it into the chat. And our friend Hannah with the SumC team will be curating that input, surfacing it within the conversation. And we'll be sure to get to your questions as much as possible throughout the call. We've got 57 minutes together, so plenty of time to really get into the details. Let me set up this conversation just briefly at a very high level. The first thing that I observe after about 20 years of EV policy, and I'm dating myself a bit, but back in 2001, my first job was with the California Air Resources Board, promoting EVs across the state to schools and utilities and local mayors. And over this time period, we've done a lot in places like California, Norway, China, all of the ZEV states in the United States to promote EVs. But quite frankly, if we look at the output and the outcomes from an equity standpoint, it's fairly unequally distributed. EVs are predominantly owned by white, wealthy households, and they're often the third or fourth or fifth vehicle of those households and not often driven. We also look at this expansion of shared mobility. Mobility is not as it was 20 years ago. We have new technologies to offer people new ways to access different forms of mobility, different forms of public transportation, different forms of two-wheel micromobility and four-wheel mobility. We also are seeing more and more policy and industry pledges. Governments and companies are saying we must get to 100% EV. We must ban internal combustion engines from our transportation technology. We must reach some sort of net zero emissions commitments. As we drive and race towards those commitments, how on earth are we going to not recreate the last 20 years of unequal results? So that's the basic context that we have in front of us. As challenging and as exciting as it could be. I'm so pleased to be joined by such expert panelists who have been working on problems like this for, in some cases, most of their careers. I'm going to start with a basic question, which is how has equity, shared mobility, electrification come up in your work recently? Share an example. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists that same question. It's my great privilege to first ask it to Dr. Shelley Francis. Dr. Shelley Francis is the co-founder of EV Noir. And Dr. Francis, I wonder if you would share with us how this has come up in your work recently.
Yeah, sure. It comes up in our work all the time. So every day for the past several years, this has been a central piece of our work. One of the areas that we focus on in terms of our work are two main areas. So it's e-mobility, best practices, and then e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's not a day or a moment that goes by that we're not thinking about these two buckets of work and how we are leveraging them and amplifying it. And so one of the things I would say that I want to talk about, just to set context in terms of our discussion and why we've gotten to the point where we are, where we're focusing on equity and how it impacts e-mobility in various communities, is that when you look at the history of transportation in frontline communities or diverse communities, you can't talk about that historical context without bringing into discussion just how racism and discrimination has really is intertwined with mobility. So from the time of separate versus equal transportation policy with Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the Supreme Court ruling, all the way up to thinking about the civil rights movement, where you have this movement for justice in terms of having equal access to safe and affordable transportation, but it was segregated transportation. And now today, at the same time, let me go back a couple of years too. At the turn of the century, we're talking about like redlining, and these were policies where certain racial ethnic groups like Black, African American, Latinx, ethnic communities, Jewish communities, they couldn't live in certain neighborhoods because they were excluded. And that ties also into the covenants, which housing covenants also were impacting where people could live, work, and play. And so that really impacts the neighborhood and the transportation systems that we see today. So that really, I wanted to level set and have that inform the conversation that we're going to have today. But also when we think about the work that we do, we approach it from thinking about the social determinants of health. And that's a framework where you have to consider how the different factors, so we call them proximate factors, such as your environment, your workplace, whether or not you have health insurance and access to clean, clean vehicles, to access to reliable transportation, employment, et cetera, and safe housing. All of those things are intertwined with mobility, access, and equity. So I just wanted to color our conversation with that lens in terms of how EV Noir approaches our work.
Shelley, thank you for that. And can I just come back to this issue of social determinants of health? I've learned a lot from you and from Shin-pei, who's worked on this in her career. And as someone who recognized that I need to be paying more attention, when you say social determinants of health, you're talking about things that are both structural, they're also individual, they're also geographic. There's a couple layers there, right?
Yes, yep, that is right. So they're all factors that impact where you are born, where you live, where you work, where you play, and where you die. And so they basically stratified several themes or several structural layers, like you suggested. It all intertwines with economic stability, education, access, and outreach, in your health and well-being. So transportation emissions and mobility, equity, and justice ties really neatly into that. It also impacts your neighborhood and built environment, as well, obviously, your health and well-being from a public health standpoint, and then also your social and community context.
Thanks, Shelley. Very good. Really look forward to revisiting that as we get deeper into the conversation. I'm next going to turn over to Giovanni Trucella, and Giovanni, I'm going to ask you the same question, but first, let me just tell everyone that Giovanni is the director of the Three Revolutions Future of Mobility program at UC Davis's Institute of Transportation Studies. If you haven't heard of UCDITS or the Three Revolutions program, do start asking people. Giovanni, you've looked at this through the research lens and the lens of academia. How recently has shared mobility, electrification, and equity come up in your work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today in this very interesting panel. I really look forward to the discussion. These are very, very important topics, and they come up in our work in a lot of ways. As you know, in my work, I directed the Three Revolutions Future Mobility program at UC Davis. UC Davis is also home to the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. So we're really, really committed to environmental sustainability, and electrification is clearly an important component into the sustainability framework for transportation. It's not the only one. Of course, we want also to think about the shape of cities, the way we use vehicles. Electrification per se will not achieve all the goals that we want to achieve in society in terms of environmental goals. And so it's very important also in my work in particular, I focus on travel behavior and really looking at the rider passenger perspective and how we can make improvements to a society that today is still largely dominated by the use of private vehicles. And so this leads to a lot of inefficiencies. And so there is a lot of innovation happening in the shared mobility field. But this is still largely a niche market that can have a big role to grow can be integrated with other transportation options, and can lead really to improvements from the sustainability standpoint in improving transportation in a society that today is very inefficient, and we have so many cars riding on the network and so many cars parked for most of the day in an extremely inefficient way. But the equity component is also the other big pillar that moves our work these days. And we look at it in several different ways. A lot of our work has been really looking at how the different components of innovation in transportation affect accessibility and mobility for the different groups in society. Whether this innovation can be everything from electrification to high-speed rail, there are very, very differential impacts in different groups and communities in our society, from the environmental externalities that communities will be exposed to the ability to access jobs and to fulfill their mobility needs. And I will give you just an example. A lot of our work in the past year and a half has really been focusing on how the COVID-19 pandemic has been reshaping transportation. Clearly, we had huge impacts. All of us today, we are on Zoom and remotely located, because still we suffer the consequences of these. And this has been reshaping activities and travel in many different ways. But the impacts have been very, very different by different groups. And so our research, we've been doing a lot of data collection and analysis of the impacts of the pandemic on different groups, has been really highlighting the very worrisome impacts that the pandemic had, in particular on certain groups of the society. They were much more likely to lose their job during the pandemic, not to be able to telecommute. All of us, we are the privileged. We still have a job, we can work remotely. We were probably more sheltered during the pandemic, but many others, they had to continue to work. They were more likely to be considered essential workers. They have reduced ability to access their jobs. They have more impacts in the day-to-day life to combine the needs of their children that couldn't go to school, their way to access their job, and so on. And shared mobility has been playing a role in this. Our data actually in our research have been showing, for example, that while there was a big decline in the use of services like Uber and Lyft or ride-hailing services for discretionary purposes, and a lot of the typical uses that many of us might do for social purposes or shopping purposes or entertainment purposes, there was a core group that really rely on these services, even during the pandemic, to access health services, hospitals, medical visits, services that otherwise would be extremely inefficient with paratransit or public transportation, or even some people are concerned in the US society to even call an ambulance or a 911 because it might be actually quite expensive. And so it's really important to think about, when we think about the equity lens, about the role that shared mobility has also in providing a service that can be very important for essential purposes for many components of our society. And I'm actually sad that I see that this doesn't get a lot of emphasis, the necessary emphasis in the media and sometimes also in the research community, because it's a very important role that today shared mobility fulfills. And we need to consider also when we think about regulations and policies to regulate the service. I will probably pause here, but happy to look, I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for that, Giovanni. I so appreciate how both you and Shelley are helping all of us lay out these pieces of context. As Shelley talked about the social determinants of health, these structural issues that exist in the social sphere. You're talking, Giovanni, about the infrastructure of transportation, its soft and hard assets that are strewn across the map unequally, and the context of automotive ownership that has dominated the transportation landscape here in the United States for the last 100 years. Giovanni, since you mentioned it, impact of COVID on electrification, shared mobility, and equity. In each of those three areas, do you think impacted well, impacted not so well? What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say the impact on shared mobility is probably the most evident. Simply because it was having a dramatic impact, especially in the first stages of the pandemic, destroying some type of services. Your company and major competitors had to remove entirely the pool services, for example, because of the need for social distancing. Demand completely dropped. There was a rebalancing of service. There was much more emphasis on freight and goods delivery rather than passenger service. And this might have actually impacts on the medium term, at least. I don't want to say like, you know, necessarily the very long term, but the medium term certainly is rebalancing the equilibrium of the system and the use of service. There is still reluctance today to call shared mobility services among certain users in particular, or share modes decline a lot and their demand remain low for public transportation, for shared mobility, while we see that private car use has really rebounded a lot. So like, you know, that is something actually that points to the fact that the pandemic is still affecting our life a lot, and in this sector in particular. There's also an indirect way the pandemic has been affecting the shared mobility sector, which is for the budget impact, the budget sheets impact, the financial impact, and probably also pushing some more restructuring on the sector. We've been seeing like, you know, merger of companies that probably were underway already planned, but somehow they were facilitated or encouraged or became faster processes during the pandemic, similar to what the airlines have been doing. A lot of them, they went into bankruptcy, they changed their fleet. Also, shared mobility companies, they've been adjusting the supply. We see also potential considerations in the micromobility sector. Some of them merge, some others are considering selling their activities, restructuring, refocusing. So the supply side impacts might have actually big impacts on demand that will last also in the future, simply because society has changed in the meantime. For the electrification sector, it's really difficult to say what the pandemic has been doing because there are a lot of other things that have been happening in the meantime. And so it's difficult to separate the confounding effect of how much was due to the pandemic versus how much is due to policy. The big change happening between 2020 and 2021 in the US, of course, was the change of administration at the federal level, which is completely reshaping the policy in the alternative fuel vehicle and ZEV adoption. The European Union is actually pushing in this direction too. The recovery plans after COVID are probably putting turbocharging investments in innovation and green economy. And this actually could speed up the process of electrification because somehow we have huge amount of funding that has been mobilitated by the governments to support and to push the economic recovery. And a lot of these is being aligned, finally, I would say, with environmental goals. And one of the major ones is electrification and push towards zero emission vehicles.
Thanks so much, Giovanni. So much to consider. It sounds like there's just no way to underestimate what COVID has done for all three segments of the discussion today. As we think about implementation on the policy side, you mentioned, Giovanni, the importance of policy and governments in this. I'm so pleased that we got to have Dan Gaddy join us for this conversation today. I had the great privilege of meeting Dan over the phone, I think about a year ago as MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council based around the Boston area, was starting to ask the question, what should we do to help the ride-hail sector electrify? And Dan was playing a very heavy role in that. So Dan is the Director of Clean Transportation Policy for the state of Massachusetts in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Dan, how has shared mobility, electrification, and equity come up in your work recently?
Thanks, Adam. Thanks to everybody here for your interest in this. I swear I'm not actually at a bar right now. I'm actually at a ride and drive event at the Northeastern campus, and this is just the room that I kind of ducked into in order to be able to do this. So probably there won't be any drinking going on behind me, but I don't really know what's going on in this building. But anyway, as Adam said, I'm Director of Clean Transportation Policy at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. One of the main responsibilities of my agency is that under the state's global warming law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, we set both the overall economy-wide limit for emissions in the state, and then we have the job of coming together on the plan to be able to achieve those limits. Governor Baker last year determined that our climate limit for 2050 would be a net zero requirement. So that's what we're planning around. So, you know, we're doing a lot of work thinking about how we can maximize clean energy and clean transportation in every place. So on some level, we're thinking about ride hailing or vehicles for hire, you know, because we're thinking about all vehicles. But then, of course, we've got a lot of other reasons to think about the ride hailing as well as the taxi use case as well. So certainly Equity is a major component of my agency's work. The legislature just passed a law that said that equity needs to be a component of all climate policies considered in the state of Massachusetts, and we were well on our way as an agency to doing that, to formalizing that commitment as well. So we're thinking about equity in everything. Obviously, equity in the electric vehicle space is kind of inherently challenging, right? I mean, we're mostly talking about, new vehicles that are significantly more expensive upfront right now. So, thinking about, what are the use cases in which we can get more low-income people to be able to drive these vehicles. That sort of thinking takes us towards vehicles for hire, towards shared mobility, towards professional drivers, who are doing this for a living, who are going to care a lot about the lower fueling costs, who are going to care a lot about the reduced maintenance needs. All of those, for all of those reasons. In addition, we know that vehicles for hire, both ride hailing and taxis, do most of their driving in dense urban areas, right? So that raises, I think, a particularly acute concern from an emissions standpoint, from a public health standpoint. Really have so many reasons to be interested in this particular part of the sector. From a public visibility perspective, obviously being able to take that first drive in an EV, we think could have real benefits from the perspective of the installation of DC fast charging stations. One of the big tasks that we have ahead of us is to try to figure out how we can get utilization rates higher for those stations in order to make them more financially viable. And vehicles for hire has been a proven strategy to help us do that. That can have benefits not just within the vehicles for hire sector, but for all kinds of communities. So really every reason. And I think it's also worth saying that as we think about the long-term plan, I think there's no question in anybody's mind that personal vehicle use, having everybody drive their own vehicle, having single occupancy vehicles take up most of the space on the roads, that is not an efficient strategy. It's not efficient in terms of the geometric space available in the city of Boston, which, if you've driven on our roads recently, I'm sure many of your drivers have, it's a challenge. It's not efficient as we think about, installing the kinds of electric infrastructure that we're going to need. If we're having to replace every internal combustion vehicle with an electric vehicle in an old city like Boston with old buildings and old infrastructure, it's a big challenge, right? So if we can think about, moving people towards shared mobility, if we can think about, how we can reduce reliance on personal vehicles at the same time as we're rapidly electrifying this sector, I think it can only make our approach to meeting our climate goals that much easier. So all of it to say, we got lots of reasons that we're thinking about this. One thing that we're doing right now is that we have an open RFP that's looking for proposals to help promote equity in electric transportation. So we're thinking about e-bikes, we're thinking about delivery services, we're thinking about ride hailing, we're thinking about car sharing. If you're interested in that, it's called the Accelerating Clean Transportation for All program. You can Google that with the Mass CEC. I think it's a really exciting opportunity for us to pilot new initiatives that can hopefully make a difference in this space.
Thanks, Dan. You heard it here. Dan's got some checks to write. So for those of you who may need funding, Massachusetts is stepping up in this space. And it sounds like, Dan, you're working at these two levels of big commitments from the Commonwealth, but also the on-the-ground work. You're out of ride and drive today to get awareness driven in the communities, which is so fundamental and important. I have to ask, since Giovanni brought up the importance of the Biden administration, Gina McCarthy is now appointed in the EPA, one of the most famous Bostonians I can think of at the moment. Is there a linkage between what the Commonwealth has found on equity and environment and now what the opportunity is in the EPA?
Yeah, but I love hearing her speak, right? I mean, you never guessed she was from Boston, right? Unless you listen to her for about 3 seconds. Yeah, no, obviously the state of Massachusetts is really well represented, in the White House, and that's going to be valuable for us. I will say, in Massachusetts, climate is a bipartisan issue, and I work for a Republican administration, and they are leading on this. So they're leading on climate. climate, with the net zero commitment, and they're leading on equity and really making that something that we're thinking about at every level within state government. So, I in a lot of ways, I feel proud of my state, and the fact that we have bipartisan cooperation, in some ways the dynamic in this state is, we came up with a climate plan that got us to 45% economy-wide reductions in December of last year, which right there, that's the most aggressive. That's more aggressive than California as a statewide commitment. It's the most aggressive commitment in the country. But the legislature wasn't strong enough for the legislature. They came back and made us go to 50%. Now we're working on that. But that's the way the climate policy works. In a state like Massachusetts, where we're both pushing each other and pushing the federal representatives forward. Everybody's really working as one to address these concerns.
Thanks, Dan. The Commonwealth pioneered, both houses supporting healthcare, now climate ambition, and if we can make some progress on equitable electrification, it will really be saying something. So thanks for bringing that perspective. Speaking of great cities like Boston and cities in general, I'm so excited that Shin-pei Tsay could join us, literally right next to me. Here in our offices in San Francisco, Shin-pei leads our team for cities and transportation policy. She's the global head of it. I have the great privilege of working on her team for her. And Shin-pei, how has this come up in your work related to electrification, shared mobility, and equity?
Yeah, where to start? Hi, everyone. Shin-pei here. Really great to be a part of this conversation and have Adam moderate for us, foremost expert in this space. And just as by way of introduction, you heard my title and where I work. I'm an Asian woman with a cream sweater. I have my hair in a ponytail, and we're in an office on the land of the Ramaytush. So I think this comes up for us in lots of different ways. Obviously, it's Uber Technologies. We're in the shared mobility space. We're thinking about it quite often, every day. But I think specifically with equity, I think it's fair to say that I was really interested in coming here and working on this because I don't think Uber, fair to say, necessarily designed its platform to be equitable, but by way of increasing and making it democratic for people to use, increased access. And in increasing access, you see some of the outcomes that Giovanni described and that we also saw most recently. We worked with WXY Studio, a urban design and planning studio based in New York City, and looked at 4 cities in the US and 4 cities globally, and saw really, really common insights from how the platform was being used during COVID. One is very much tracks what Giovanni said, that there was a higher fraction of lower income users on the platform before COVID. We looked at baseline before COVID, and then tested about once a quarter through COVID with the last test in March 2021. And there was a higher fraction of low-income users. They were going to essential services, as Giovanni says. So they were hospitals, healthcare institutions, but also essential jobs, distribution centers. It was fascinating to see that. And you saw the precipitous drop in all the social uses, the higher income uses, but you saw the steady state of people using the platform to get to these essential services. So in some ways, the platform is being used to help with all of the rest of us who are privileged to work from home, be able to do those kinds of things. We're really interested in how we can improve those kinds of experiences for people and work with cities to make that more known, to think about ways of complementing existing service so that the platform can support and increase access in those ways, and micromobility, obviously, with transit, et cetera. But I think on the other side of the coin, the interesting thing about being at Uber is then you're also thinking about the drivers and the people who use the platform for work. And that's also to shout Dr. Francis's point, that's also something that's very, very much top of mind, where we don't want to replicate the impacts of the last 20 years. There are social determinants of health that show that there's this linkage. It's a correlation. We're just starting on better understanding where these overlaps are. But if we see this concentration of riders having use on the platform, we're also seeing the outsized impact that the drivers can have to be part of the solution, which I think is really fascinating. And as we also think about the platform in the future becoming even more multimodal, to provide more options, to meet more types of needs, like we have a product that is directly hooks into healthcare institutions to reduce missed appointments, to help people get to see doctors or what have you, to get prescriptions delivered as a community health solution. Those kinds of things can start to add up. And if you're thinking about then, what are the vehicles on the platform? Who are the people using them? I think there's a huge opportunity for us to make a big impact, even though rideshare right now is such a small part of any city's transportation system. So, but I think those are some of the ways that we're really thinking about this, and really excited to hear more from the panel here.
I think that brings in this very concrete focus of an actual product that's out in the world being used, and combines what we heard from the other panelists. Shin-pei, I would have come to this conversation about equitable electrification thinking, okay, we're mostly talking about the drivers. You're talking about the riders, and that there's been this increase in underserved groups using the platform for just getting from A to B. That might not seem obvious to a lot of folks who would consider Uber a luxury good in many ways. How is that true of all on-demand mobility? What do we think?
Well, it's definitely, I think what we see with the majority of trips that anyone takes, let's say you have a transportation, budget, you have a certain number of trips that you have to make as a person to go to your job or go to school or run your errands and do the day-to-day things. And the majority of those trips in the United States anyway are in private cars. And we see this increase in private cars, sales going up, VMT going up. Yet transit recovery is plateauing. It's very challenging. Rideshare is also very challenging. And so I think that there has to be a lot more done to try to take a piece out of that private car driving, to reduce those private car trips. We see shared mobility as sort of the insurance, right? Like if you don't have an option, it's a mobility insurance. If you don't have an option, it's a relatively expensive option. And if we care about earners, it will always be more expensive than public transit, right? That's the way that works. That's the way that equation works. And that's okay. That might be fine, because what we're trying to do is to support transit's operations. We're trying to support other people getting people, maybe they can carpool. Maybe there's ways that they can get access to a trip. We're not trying to become every single trip. But I think that mobility insurance ended up being quite critical to people keeping their jobs, let's say, or making it to school, getting their degree, that kind of thing.
Thank you for that. And speaking of accessibility, Shin-pei modeled something that I recognize we needed to be doing throughout. Tsay and Hannah have a great interest in seeing that these sessions are fully accessible, even to those who may be visually impaired, either listening now or listening in the future. So we will all be describing ourselves, and I'll go next. Thank you, Shin-pei, for that. I'm a white male. I'm wearing a purple shirt, and I'm sitting in San Francisco. What I want to do next is go a little bit layer deeper. So we've talked about the high level, a lot of the big structural issues on the table. Mackenzie, thank you for your question about used EVs. I can see there's an interest to go down into a couple of key areas. So what I'd like to do is talk about EVs and shared mobility and the equity implications of that effort. And I want to ask the panelists about where we see green shoots and where we see the gaps. So what's working? What are the challenges we have to get over? I'm going to go, Dr. Francis, to you first for this with the what's working. Let's get at least the positives. Where do we see EVs, shared mobility starting to show positive results in terms of equitable access?
Sure. So I'll start off. I'm an African American female with glasses. I am wearing a black and white dress, and I am sitting here in Atlanta. So let's see. I can talk about in terms of what we see as successes is an approach where we're centering communities and the drivers, utilizing a human-centric approach to really inform potential solutions. So that to me is utilizing a grassroots approach. So you're getting feedback from the treetops, so the ultimate decision makers, but the ultimate decision makers aren't really just driving the process. It's really flipping the paradigm so that you have the drivers informing the process in terms of what will work best for them. So for instance, I want to speak about some work that we had the opportunity to do with both Uber and Grid Alternatives. So Grid Alternatives and EV Noir had the opportunity, as we're thinking about accelerating electrification and shared mobility, like what does that look like? We know that we can't meet our climate change goals without tackling transportation emissions. And so in order to bring the conversation along, we really had to make sure that we were going to the heart of the problem. And for us, the potential solutions really lay at the heart of the problem. So that's why we had to bring in the experts. And the experts are the drivers, the individuals who live and work in frontline communities where almost 60% are originating their drives and culminating their drives in frontline communities and communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And so, what some of the things that we found was that there is bandwidth and interest in making this transition, but we have to make it easy for them. We also have to give them the tools that they need to make this transition successful. So that means we've got to start with educating the drivers. We have to educate them in a way that is culturally relevant and that is, easily processable and they can access the information, and as well as see other individuals who are on the platform who have been driving electric vehicles. They could be great role models in showing that this technology is for them. And the other piece that we have to do is make it financially feasible for drivers. So, if they already have a fossil fuel vehicle, they're going to have to transition to an electric vehicle. So how do we make that process easier for them? How do we make that more accessible? And I think there's some really great opportunities with private-public partnerships to really make that an affordable process for drivers. And then the last piece will be that just ensuring that charging infrastructure is distributed in an equitable manner. And so we're seeing a lot more pilots coming out and programs being put in place that are going to address charging deserts in frontline communities. And when we say charging deserts, we mean that there's limited to no charging infrastructure in those communities. And so we can't expect individuals to adopt this transportation paradigm shift without feeling comfortable and feeling empowered to make that transition. So I think those are some of the things that we need to think about as we are transitioning. And again, in terms of what we know works is really centering the problem centering the solution where the problem or challenge exists, so that those who are impacted worse than first can really help inform what those solutions and strategies looks like. So those are some of the things that we know that will work well.
So just to be clear, you said 60%, did you say 60% in your experience in looking at the data of did you say drivers beginning their day in frontline communities?
Yes, beginning and ending their days in frontline communities. And then when you think about this, that huge footprint that they have, rideshare drivers obviously have a bigger footprint compared to individuals who are driving their personal vehicles. But when they drop off one person, they often have to drive a good distance to get to that next rider. So if we can eliminate that, eliminate the pollution, the overabundance of pollution that is resulting from those trips, then we can reduce emissions by 75% in some examples, as well as save about 100,000 plus premature deaths to overexposure to transportation emissions.
Really significant results for both those frontline communities and all communities adjacent to those. And
yes.
I saw it come up in the chat from Mackenzie that there's interest just learning more about EV Noir. I don't think a lot of people recognize that this is your business to do this work that you work with companies to consult on EV adoption in frontline communities, engagement in frontline communities. Would you mind just a quick pitch on EV Noir and EV Hybrid Noir?
Okay, my quick 30-second commercial. So again, EV Hybrid Noir is one of the leading voices in e-mobility best practices, as well as e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We work with everyone from utilities to transit authorities to nonprofits to municipalities. We're working with 26 cities across the country to help inform their electrification strategy and e-mobility strategies. And so we can work with your organization if there's a need and interest. And then we're also the founders of another membership-based organization, which is a 501c3 called EV Hybrid Noir. And that's the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. We have thousands of members across the United States, a number of different chapters here in California. And we also have chapters in Canada, Europe, Asia, the continent of Africa, and a growing presence in the Caribbean. And we work with that entity to really elevate and amplify e-mobility solutions for all communities so that they have access to safe, reliable, and equitable transportation. And I do want to add that, I'm shifting back to the rideshare conversation, with introducing electric vehicles into rideshare, because of the demographic, who the rideshare users are, where they're facilitating the rides, it's really a wonderful opportunity to expose more communities, particularly folks in frontline communities who may not ordinarily have the opportunity to, what we say, touch, feel, and experience electric vehicles. They have an opportunity to see them in their community, and they begin to normalize what transportation looks like. So the more they see it, the more they see their friends utilizing it and talking about it, or they have the opportunity to ride in an electric vehicle and learn from the driver themselves, then that's a really good marketing and communication opportunity to have people begin to shift how they're thinking about transportation and mobility.
I'm not sure how you at EV Noir manage to be people-centric and tech-centric and data-centric all at the same time. Most of us would so aspire to do that, but you make it look very easy. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Francis, I really appreciate that. So I want to go, we've learned a little bit about some of the green shoots, some of the opportunity areas as it relates to EVs and shared mobility, in some cases specifically ride hail. Giovanni, I wonder if we could learn a little bit more about the gaps, about the challenges that face us. If you don't mind, if you have the ability to cover used EVs in that chat would be helpful, but where do you see it, at least at the high level, for equitable access to shared mobility and electrification? What are the 2 or 3 major gaps that we face?
Absolutely. And first of all, for our friends that are connected online, I am the white man wearing red glasses and a blue and white shirt and speaking with a funny Italian accent. Back to this question, I think we live in a time in which we have many opportunities and some major challenges. I want to touch on the opportunities. There is one that is really associated with the differences in the usage of the vehicles for shared mobility and ride hailing versus a privately owned vehicle. And I want to point to the work of some of the great colleagues working with us at UC Davis. Ken Kurani has been studying in particular with Angela Sanguinetti and many other colleagues, the adoption of electric vehicles in general, but also in the ride-hailing sector. Alan Jen has been studying in particular the use of fleets like Uber and Lyft or other companies in the shared mobility space and charging issues and needs for that. The research is showing us that the usage patterns of a lot of ride-hailing drivers actually could be fairly compatible with electric vehicles and actually help from the point of view of cost of operation of the vehicle, because electrification could actually really bring an advantage to these drivers. So drivers from ride-hailing fleets, they do a lot of miles, could actually benefit quite a bit from the electrification compared to somebody that just buys a car and uses for commuting or non-commuting purposes. And so that is something that's a huge potential that is there. There is some range anxiety, but of course, with improved range of electric vehicles today, this is going away. And also research has been showing that the vast majority of trips and usage patterns could be compatible with an electric vehicle in the ride-hailing industry. But it's also potential that is largely unused today. And there are some barriers that they still are there. One of these is associated with the cost of the purchase of acquisition of an electric vehicle, or in general alternative fuel vehicle, which is still higher than traditional internal combustion engines. It's also a problem that affects in particular lower income drivers and those that have a reduced ability to purchase new expensive vehicles. There's also the lack of used EV on the market. So we really have an issue. A lot of drivers, for a number of reasons, they really rely on used cars for optimizing their expenses and purchasing vehicles which are lightly used, let's say a few years of age, but also there is a lack of availability of good EV options in the used car market. And there is also the issue of the lease characteristics. So there is a huge market for the ability to lease a vehicle that can be used in the ride-hailing industry. And this really is not a market that has been well targeted, with a few exceptions. There's been some programs to bring EVs for lease formats for electric vehicles for the ride-hailing industry. But in a lot of other cases, the lease options are still referred to internal combustion engine vehicles. And that is actually it's a barrier actually to the market. For a lot of years, we have seen, for example, the role of car rental companies. Car rental companies flooding the market with a lot of lightly used, I like to call them, vehicles which are being in service only for 1 or 2 years in the proper car rental business. And then they are retired from the market where we rent them in an airport or in a city. Usually the useful life is the first 25 to 30,000 miles only in that market. And then they are being brought, instead of being used, sold on the used car market. In the past few years, those vehicles that were lightly used were brought for a second life to the short-term leases for the ride-hailing industry, but the percentage of EVs in the car rental fleets is extremely low. And so we have a huge flooding of vehicles that are in this compact segment, rather affordable vehicles, non-EV, the Nissan Sentra, the small kind of compacts from several different manufacturer type of vehicles that were being rather affordable to lease for ride-hailing industry. And it's also a non-incentive to switch to electric vehicles because of the presence of that type of lease. And so that brings the question, if we want to electrify that segment of the market, we probably need to worry how we can electrify the upstream market with the car rental industry, which is a completely different problem because it's not an easy market to electrify. Of course, what we're talking has been largely reshaped because during COVID, the entire car rental industry has been completely reshaped. And so that has been also bringing huge modification to this. But the last point I want to mention is also charging. A lot of times we think about charging for the needs of privately owned vehicles. And that is very different. Somebody that charges at home, somebody that charges at work. The needs for charging are very, very different. The research has been showing fleet drivers, in many cases, especially like, low-income drivers, many times they need to cover significant differences from the place where they live to the places where there is a good market for ride-hailing. I'm thinking about downtown San Francisco, the Bay Area in general, New York, other areas. And then the need for charging locations and efficient fast charging is actually very, very different from the one the used vehicles, the privately owned vehicles. Now, of course, I'm not saying that there is nothing going on in these areas, but I'm saying that these are still barriers. There are steps that are being made in this area, but we need to do much more because we need to somehow promote in these ways, like, create a more EV-friendly environment. And the last, of course, is education. In many cases, drivers and the work of somebody like Shelley is very important in this area because in many cases, drivers that could be actually fine with electric vehicles, they don't even know the option, so they might be resistant to the option. And there is a lot to do in education and really in bringing the benefits, and not only in creating the benefits, but also making them accessible and making them, the people in the field, aware of these opportunities. I'll pause here.
Thanks, Giovanni. And I don't find your Italian accent silly at all. I find it one of the most wise sounding ones I've heard yet. So thank you for that. Dan, this leaves you, and we'll get to, you'll need to describe yourself because I think you're the last on our panel to do so. Just a quick time check for everybody. We've got about 9 minutes left. So if you haven't gotten a question into the chat, and likely that's almost everyone, feel free to get one in there now. We'll see if we can get to it. Dan, you've heard from Shelley and Giovanni some of the opportunities and the disconnects in the world of practice of EVs and shared mobility, and about the fact from Giovanni that the policy apparatus over the last 20 years, if I can call it that, has predominantly focused on the primary market, selling cars, and then we don't know what happens to those cars. We don't know if we're getting the emissions benefits. We don't know if we're getting to people who deserve and need them. How are you starting to think about this at the policy level?
Yeah, thanks. For the audience, I'm let's call it early middle-aged white guy with a bit of a goatee, kind of in a weird, sitting in kind of a weird empty bar, which is actually just some random room at the Northeastern campus. You know, I thought, you know, a couple of great points, you know, made by my co-panelists. You know, I think, you know, as we think about near-term opportunities, you know, I think some of the kind of rental, short-term rental fleets, some of those drivers, the ones who are using the kind of Uber fleets, the Lyft Express platforms, represent a great opportunity, you know, in part because they're driving vehicles that, you know, are owned by, you know, more well-capitalized companies potentially. So, you know, so there's some potential, in that respect. You know, I think, you know, there's this chicken and the egg question about the utilization at DC fast chargers, right? So like one of the reasons that I said that I want more TNC vehicles to be electric is because I want to increase the utilization on DC fast chargers. Because right now DC fast charging is not cost effective. It's more expensive than gasoline in Massachusetts, which is because of demand charges, and we're working on it. But you know, that's part of the challenge here is, you know, how do we get those early adopters on the road so that we have a robust fleet of EVs in the TNC fleets, so that they're driving down the cost of charging, so that more people want to charge, and then, you know, head to a virtuous cycle. I think one, you know, kind of contrast that maybe explains some of our interest in this space is, you know, if you think, you know, this state, you know, made a commitment along with the state of California to think about vehicle emission standards that would go up to 100% of new vehicle sales for passenger vehicles by 2035, which is a great commitment. And it's wonderful that California has the kind of authority to be able to get the OEMs to do that. But at the same time, you know, we compare it to what you guys are saying, what Uber is saying, what Lyft is saying, what California regulations are requiring of the ride hailing companies. You know, it's more like 100% or 90% under the regulation on road, right, of the vehicles on the platform. So, you know, I think when we're thinking about some of these fleet strategies, you know, part of the motivation here is that we see, you know, what the potential that once we can make the business case, once we can get those initial fleet vehicles and get costs down and get to the point where it's a slam dunk business case for the TNC driver or for the fleet operator that is using these vehicles, or a taxi fleet operator. Once we have that slam dunk economic case, we've created the conditions for that, we could see really rapid electrification, more rapid than we're going to be able to see if we're just reliant on everybody to slowly turn over their personal vehicles, which we know is kind of a slow process because, you know, of all the reasons, you know. So anyway, I think that all that's really important stuff. And then, you know, I think the other point that Dr. Francis made just about that first vehicle experience, the potential impact on the rider, that's something that we really want to think about how we capitalize on. I've heard anecdotally that from EV TNC drivers that's just a very natural place for people to be able to talk about EVs. It's just you know, you're sitting in the car with a guy. What else are you going to talk about? You're in a car you've never been in. before, right? Like it's just a natural thing to be like, hey, how do you charge this thing? And, what do you do with it? It's just, I think that the EV TNC driver or the EV taxi driver, really has the potential to be an ambassador for the technology in their communities. And, I think that is such a valuable and critical role. So, really all in and really excited about the potential use. Let me just say one other thing, since you were talking about places where we can use this technology, is I just did a little e-cargo bike demonstration out here. And boy, if I was an Uber Eats driver, or if I was a DoorDash driver, if, in Boston or in Cambridge or in, Brookline, I mean, it seems like a real winner to me as a way of getting out of traffic, in addition to having a low emissions and not very expensive vehicle. So, I think there could be great potential in that kind of space as well.
Boy, we need couriers, Dan. So if you're interested, we're happy to onboard you to help deliver for Eats. But we didn't even have time to talk about e-bikes, and that's been something that's changed in a big way over COVID. That'll have to be for another time. We are nearly at time. I will, in just about a minute, hand it over to Hannah to help close out our session. There's been so many incredible things that we've heard in terms of getting the topics on the table. The one thing I'll say from our experience is that we resonate with what you're saying, Dan, in terms of, you called it slam dunk economics for drivers. Drivers on Uber, at least as of our last transparency report last year, use hybrid vehicles, so Priuses and the like, about 5 to 6 times more than their average car owning counterparts in the US economy. And it's because of the economics. They work for them. The interesting wrinkle about that is the battery EVs will be competing with those Prius economics over this next decade. It's a good competition to have, but that's the challenge. It will be very difficult to convince a driver, particularly those from racial and economic justice communities, to get out of that Prius, which they're making more money in, and shift to a battery EV, unless we fix the systemic challenges that have been raised on this call. With that, Shin-pei, any closing remarks?
No,
just for a quick last word.
This was such a great conversation. I'm so glad we could be a part of it. Yeah.
Well, I'll hand it over to Hannah momentarily. Dr. Francis, Dan, Giovanni, thank you so much for your time and expertise. I hope those of you listening in had a lot of reasons to then be reaching out to each of them individually on their remarkable work. Please do so. And Hannah, any final remarks?
Can I make a quick note?
Oh, of course.
Yeah, because I think there is a topic that didn't come up a lot in this panel, but Shin-pei pointed to it. A little bit, we have been talking a lot about electrification in the shared mobility market, almost thinking in isolation about this. Shin-pei mentioned also the importance to consider more system-wide perspective about the integration of these services with public transportation, micromobility. So perhaps this will be left for another discussion another day, but it's very important, the electrification and the equity issues, to be seen into this role that shared mobility and ride-hailing plays in the integration of these services, that is not only just getting a ride on Uber, but it's getting a ride on Uber and accessing a subway system, and potentially integrating with bikes, having subscription models, and potentially reduce the vast majority of car market that is just a single passenger driving a privately owned vehicle, which is really the problem with the American society and a lot of other places around the world. And so the potential, I think, is really there. We don't win only electrifying a niche market, but we win also making this market bigger.
Well said. Well
Yes,
put.
I was just going to say the cost of private car driving right now is so cheap because of the policy apparatus that everyone has been speaking to. And so, yes, I think we all collectively have to think about not just the EV apparatus, but the larger ways that we subsidize private driving.
And yeah, right. It's cheap, once you socialize the cost of the parking, you socialize,
Right.
A lot of the cost of the infrastructure, once other people pay for a lot of that stuff, right?
That's right. The pocketbook cost, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, taxpayers were convinced a long time ago to subsidize all of that infrastructure for private car use, and that's why it's so cheap.
You know, I would love to just say, as a research question out there, if anybody has an ability to calculate how much value there is right now in the real estate in the Boston market that's devoted to parking, that is a number that I've always wanted to know exactly what that number is, because it seems like it would be a very large number, both here and in San Francisco. I'm sure it would be an enormous number.
Yes.
Likely a very big one. I've seen figures of 8 parking spaces for citizen in some cities around the country. So yeah, please do reach out to Dan with that figure if you happen to have it. Hannah, any final words? Thanks for letting us run a little bit over. Thanks to everybody for hanging on, and Sumsi for making space for this chat.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think that was I know, a really great place to finish. I think, you know, our theme being the big shift, we are hoping to try and think through all those systems here in the month of July and see where that takes us. So thank you, Giovanni, for that last note. And thank you so much, Adam, Shin-pei, Dan, and Dr. Francis as well. Really great discussion, and one that, you know, we will absolutely be continuing to have. And thank you so much to Uber for their, you know, continued partnership and sponsorship. We would not be able to put these events on without you. So thank you so much.